Welcome everyone to the OpenEdge database top 10 new features list in OpenEdge 11 and 12. I'm not sure that everyone's going to agree with me on all of these features, but here's my top 10 list. Hey, we can talk about it later on when we do the Q&A. So let's get started. So first, some notes. This is a recorded session, so this is not happening live right now. So there will be a Q&A afterwards that you guys can join in. We can argue about this top 10 list afterwards, all right? Now you need to exit theater mode so that you can see the link to join the Zoom session after the presentation. So don't forget to do that. That's tripped up a couple of people, I think. So watch out for that. And there is a chat during this online presentation, but not all of you are going to be watching at the same time. So the chat might be desynchronized. So I'm going to try and wait until the end to answer your questions as much as possible. But I will be on the chat during the session itself too. So looking forward to talking to you after the presentation. So this was really hard. You know, we bounced around some ideas between all of us over at White Star Software. We came up with 35 contenders from OpenEdge 11 and 12 alone. But this is a top 10 list, not a top 35 list. So we had to vote and whittle it down and give you the top 10 list. And these are only database improvements, right? We're not programmers. You guys can do your own top 10 programmer improvements, object-oriented class inheritance stuff. I don't know anything about that stuff really, so knock yourselves out if somebody wants to do a top 10 OpenEdge 4GL. Ask Peter Judge. He'll take care of that for you, all right? Now, there were some clear winners. Some of these you're going to see, they're without argument. But some of the other ones, we kind of bounced them forth a few times to come up with this list. And I bet you even people at White Star Software who work with me won't necessarily be happy with my choices. All right? So, quick take here. I think there's an interactive chat I talked about. Why don't you go ahead, enter your top 10 list. All right? I'm just going to pause for a minute here and let you enter your top 10 list. Enter your top feature in the chat. Let's see what happens. See how you match my feature list compared to your feature list. Now just pick one, everyone in the chat. Let's go ahead and let's see what happens in the chat. And we'll talk about it again in the Zoom Q&A session afterwards, all right? Here we go. We just got a few more seconds. Get your votes in. Let's go, everyone. Great. Get your votes in. Just a few more seconds before we get started. All right, great. Here we go. All right, let's get started. Okay, wait. Who am I? Who am I? So some of you have heard me speak before. Some of you haven't. But why should you listen to me? Why do I have the right? Why does White Star Software have the right to come up with this top 10 list? Well, I've kind of been doing this since 1994, and that's 26 years now, going on 27 years that I've been doing OpenEdge DBA work. Back when it was Progress DBA work, I graduated from engineering in university, and I went straight into an OpenEdge database firm. I'm really just a technical consultant. I'm not a programmer, never been a programmer. And the fun thing about working for White Star Software is we have a really wide range of experience. You know, our smallest customer is probably 10 concurrent users, and our largest customer is 4,000. I take it back. We have a customer now who's 15,000 concurrent users. I should fix this slide. So we go from the range of, 10 users to 15,000 concurrent users. So we get to see everything. And really we get to see every platform, AIX, HPUX, Linux, Windows, even some Solaris platforms, though I don't really think there's many of those. HPUX also is kind of going the way of the dodo bird, unfortunately, but we really get to see a little bit of everything. I've worked on VAX, VMS back in the day. I've gotten to see everything over the years, and that's a lot of fun. A lot of fun when you work in this many platforms. And if you have a question or if you want to talk to me about something afterwards, my email address can't be simpler than pk@wss.com. Please feel free to contact me and send me an email with your questions or with your comments. You can also come visit us in the White Star Software virtual booth. We're in the expo area. We're a gold sponsor this year during the conference. So come into the booth here and talk to us. Who's White Star Software? Well, we're thought leaders really in the database space. We've been around for 30 plus years, and we have 4 of the top OpenEdge DBAs in the OpenEdge world. You know, names that you've heard of, names that you've trusted for decades. Adam Backman, Tom Bascom, Dan Foreman, and really I'm proud to be able to put my name on the same list with these giants in the OpenEdge world, right? I've been doing this for 26 years. I'm the young guy. I'm still the guy who brings coffee if we had an office. Now we all work from home. And we're also the authors of ProTop, which is the best OpenEdge performance monitoring and alerting tool in the market. And you'll hear me talking a lot about ProTop during this conference. Some of you might have been in my talk yesterday when we talked about the workshop about ProTop. I'm going to talk a little bit about ProTop in some other sessions. So will Tom and Adam. So we are always talking about ProTop. There's a free version, and really we encourage you to go to wss.com, download the free version, try it for yourself, and contact us. We'd love to talk to you more about using ProTop. All right, and here you go, ProTop again. So without further ado, our top 10 list of the top OpenEdge database enhancements available to you. And let's see how many of these you're using in your environment. Ready, set, okay, I lied. No, okay. Before we get to the top 10 list, oh, here we go. Before we get to the top 10 list, let me talk to you about some of the near misses, the honorable mentions. I told you we had a list of 35. Let me show you the ones that just missed the list before I get to the top 10 list, all right? So sorry in advance if you're disappointed. You can argue with me afterwards during the Q&A. So I want to start with the really new stuff, the stuff that just came out last week, last month, the last few months in 12.2 and 12.3. Some of these things sound really cool, but we don't know anybody who's put this stuff into production yet, so we really don't know what the effect in production is. How useful are these really going to be? I think they're going to be very cool and very useful, but they don't quite make it into the top 10 list yet, just because we haven't had a chance to use them. And I'm lying again because one of them made its way into the top 10 list, but we'll see that later on, okay? We'll see, all right? So let's talk about Conv 11.12 without replication rebase. And so I haven't had the opportunity to use this, but it's huge. We have customers with terabyte databases who are using OpenEdge replication. They'll have one site here and the other site is on the other side of the continent. In another continent, we have people replicating from the east coast of North America to the west coast, from North America to Europe. If you have to rebase a 123 terabyte database, which means transferring 123 terabytes of data across the ocean, that's hours and hours and hours. And there's a lot of problems associated with that kind of downtime, right? Your locked AI extents, for example, while you're waiting. You can't back up your database because you have to resynchronize your source and your targets before you can take your next backup of the source database. So there's so much going on when you need to rebase a target database. And so this ability to not have to rebase when you convert from 11 to 12 is huge thing. So again, haven't had a chance to do it yet in production, but I already see where we have multiple clients with 100 gig databases, multi-100 gig terabyte databases who are going to be absolutely ecstatic to know that they don't have to rebase their target databases when they convert from it to 11 to 12. And that's amazing option. The other really cool one that I'm excited about is this online table reorganization. So I'd love for the chance to try that out. Haven't quite gotten there yet, but there's a couple of things that this feature does. So the first one is it defragments records. So fragmentation, if you're running ProTop, if you run a health check on ProTop and it runs through the DBL analysis, it'll show you which tables are fragmented, which tables you need to worry about. You can see that. This will defragment those tables online. And not only will it fragment them for you, it'll reorganize the data physically in the order of an index that you specify. So by default, that'll of course be the primary index, but you can say, you know what, not only defragment by data, but physically reorder it in the type 2 storage area using this particular index. So imagine now you reduce logical scatter on the index that's most used in your application, and you eliminate fragmentation without the difficulty of how we had to do that in the past. So in the past, we had to dump and load the table, or we had to do a table move from one storage area to another to essentially simulate a dump and load. That requires extra disk space if you're doing a table move. That requires downtime if you're doing a dump and load. Now you can do all of that online while the application is still running. Now, one thing you have to watch out for that is the row ID is going to change, right? You're physically moving the record from one place to another place, and the row ID is the physical address of the record inside the database. So do be mindful in this feature, the row ID will change, especially if you're doing it online and you still have some legacy code that is relying on the row ID even temporarily. So watch out for that. But really, I'm excited about this new feature that's available in 12.3. All right, so what else? We've got some new database connection parameters. One is the alternate database connection parameters. And what those say is essentially, if you get disconnected from your primary databases, you can automatically connect conceivably to the secondary databases, which are your replication targets, for example. So you can set up the command line to say, hey, if I lose my connection to these databases, let me go try and connect to these other databases. So very cool parameter, these alternate database connection parameters. And on the same front, there's this auto reconnect on stop. So if you get disconnected from a database, which raises a stop condition, you can tell the language now. You can tell your ABL session to reconnect to the databases that were specified at startup when the stop condition occurs. So very, very cool. Again, if something happens and a database crashes, which causes the clients to raise a stop condition, and now they can reconnect to those databases. Again, haven't tried them myself. I don't have any real world experience with these things, but they look really cool. I'm going to reserve judgment on how useful they are in the real world until we get an opportunity to try them, all right? And then the other thing that's really coming down the pipe that's interesting is there's finally some new online schema changes that you can do. So things that don't change the actual structure, labels, for example, or changing int to int64, you can now do online without stopping the database, without having to have a single user access to the database. So very cool. Continuing what Progress has been doing for decades now of making it easier and easier to do online schema changes, easier and easier to maintain 24/7 operations in your database. So again, haven't had a chance to use these particular options myself, but really excited that they're coming down the pipe. Honorable mentions. There's a whole bunch of new VST improvements from 11.0 all the way to 12.3, and there's so many of these that really I can't mention any particular one, right? So we can start with _DB Params. So they finally centralized all the database startup parameters into _DB Params, and even allowed you the ability to modify some of these startup parameters by directly modifying the VST. So that's really exciting that you have access now to _DB Params. But there's so many more of these parameters. There's a new startup parameter that has the number of checkpoints. And so traditionally, Progress has always only kept the last 8 checkpoints in memory in the virtual system tables, which is problematic if you're checkpointing every second or every 2 seconds because you have a performance issue, while your checkpoint table only has the last 8 seconds. And so now you can change that dynamically. You can change the number of checkpoints, for example, that are stored in memory, and the new default is 32. So really excited about those kinds of parameters and a whole bunch of other improvements to VSTs around server processes against user processes, OpenEdge replication, servers and agents. Really a lot of stuff that's been added in the VSTs that you're going to be able to use. All right, so take a look at those. Really just too many of them for me to list right here in this session. Another honorable mention, because it's just cool, even if it's not necessarily 100% useful to your production environment, is they finally added help on the command line utility. So you can see on the screen, I got the screen in front of me here, you can do pro-util index build minus help, and there is all the syntax. You don't have to open the PDFs anymore to pull out the syntax. So I haven't checked if all the utilities have online help, but certainly a whole bunch of them do. Pro-util and pro-struct, I assume RF-util. I haven't tested them all myself, but again, really cool, right? Even people like me who've been doing this for almost 30 years now, I don't know all the parameters out by heart, and it doesn't help that some of them have a dash before, some of them don't have a dash before. Who remembers all of the little, you know, combinations and permutations? We're always looking at the documentation here, and now it's nice to have this command line utility help, so you can just look at the syntax and say, oh yeah, that's right, inactive indexes. That's what the word was. Great, thank you. And now you can start your command. So really a fun one here. Finally, that they added this little extra here into the command line utility. So we're excited about that. All right, here's my close but no cigar list. These are parameters that almost made it into our top 10 list, but not quite there. I'll talk about these quickly. And again, if you disagree with me, meet me in the Zoom meeting afterwards. Minus Pika, that's a great one. You know, from the beginning of Fathom replication, Pika started at 256 and 1024 and 8192, and at some point I think they just said a million. Just set it to any value you want. We don't really care. Another really cool one, OpenEdge replication sets, and that's a feature that they added in 11.7, which makes it easier for you when you go from a source to a target, when you transition, to continue replication. So a really interesting feature, this replication set, and we've implemented this at a couple of customers. So a really cool new feature. The minus diagnostic data collection parameters, another cool set of parameters. If there is a problem, the database will automatically gather some information for you when the problem occurs, like a lock table overflow, for example. User notify time, very cool parameter, so that users, when there's an online schema change, like an index activate, it notifies the users to update their schema cache. Previously, those users had to exit their session, start a new session so that they could get the new schema cache, and now they can do that live, which is very cool. DB log file auto archive and truncate. And as much as I like this new parameter which automatically truncates and archives the log file, you know, we've been doing this for a year. We found really good workarounds. So I'm happy that it's a startup parameter now, but I've been able to work around that no problem over the past 10 years. So didn't quite make it into our top 10 list. Multi-threaded _mproserve, multi-threaded 4GL servers. I haven't had a chance to really benchmark the improvement of the round robin server, which was up until, you know, the version 12 multi-threaded versus the multi-threaded server, you know, and not talking about server-side joins, really just talking about the multi-threaded server. So I'm reserving that. I'm happy it's there. Finally, you know, join the fray, but I don't know how valuable it is out there in the real world yet. And finally, table partitioning, which was added at 11.4. Really important for larger customers who have very large databases, the ability to partition data essentially by a where clause, saying, you know, 2012 goes here and 2014 goes there and 2018 goes here. So a really cool feature if you have a large database to physically partition your data. Let's get started with number 10, and as promised, here is a new parameter that's available in 12.3, and that's biscantime. And again, I haven't had a chance to use this at a real customer. I don't have any production customers yet using 12.3, but I'm really excited about this parameter. So one of the big problems that we've seen over the years with the BI and with long transaction is where if you have a long running transaction, or if you have a user that's stuck in a transaction and then they leave, they go for coffee or something, and these users, they keep a BI cluster blocked, and the empty clusters after that, call it the blocked BI cluster, cannot be reused, and you get a you get caught in this BI growth, and the BI grows and grows and grows until eventually it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 gigabytes. It fills up the disk and your database crashes. And if it wasn't bad enough that your database crashes, when your database comes back up, it has to go through undo, redo processing, and it has to scan the entire BI file. And if you're on an older version of Progress especially, scanning that 50, 60, 100 gig BI file could take hours. I have seen 100 gig BI files take 4 or 5 hours to scan, and there's absolutely nothing you can do. You have to sit there and wait, and you have to tell your management, hey, this happened, and we have to wait until it finishes. And really, that's one of the reasons tools like ProTop exist, so that we can monitor for old transactions, monitor for abnormal BI file usage, and alert you before the problem actually hits your production environment, before your users are actually affected by these problems. And BI scan time is there to mitigate one of those problems. And what it does is it says, hey, if you see that there are BI clusters that are empty and unused after the blocked BI cluster, then you know what? Go ahead and reorder the BI clusters. Go put those BI clusters ahead of the blocked one so that they can be reused. And what that does is it allows you to use all the empty BI clusters and then just, we'll say, ignore the blocked BI cluster. And that really potentially reduces, I'll say, because I haven't seen it in action, but it potentially reduces that crazy abnormal BI growth when you have a long-running transaction or one of those dormant transactions that's blocking the BI file. So really, really excited about that, and I'm excited to see that in action. Now, you still want to monitor for long transactions. There's still other problems that can happen, but at least with BI scan time in 12.3, we hope that the problem of abnormal BI growth is now in the past. Now, be careful. This is really only the case where you have a dormant transaction, right? So someone opens an order record, starts to modify the record, starts a transaction, and then leaves, because all the BI clusters that are going to be filled afterwards will get cleaned up and emptied and written to the disk, and those will be available to be reused. If you have a long-running active transaction that's modifying the database, well, guess what? All of those BI clusters are going to be busy. They're going to be part of that transaction, so you will still have BI growth. So it's really the case when you have an old transaction, but not an old transaction that's continuously modifying the database. So watch out for that. But again, really excited about BI scan time as a parameter. All right. Number 9. Hey, there we go. New default startup parameters. Woohoo! Hey, we always change these startup parameters anyways. It's kind of a default for us. We come in, we run ProTop a health check, and we're like, oh, you're running the default value for AI buffs. You're running the default value for BI buffs. You haven't enabled LRU skips. So let's just go ahead and implement some very logical default parameters. There isn't really any downside to enabling these parameters. So finally, Progress said, hey, let's just set these as the new default values. So LRU skips 100, AI buffs, BI buffs 64, minus MM of 8192. That's a great parameter if you're doing client-server communications. And we actually even bump it up usually to 16384 or the maximum value of 32K. We don't even bother with 8192, but you get most of the bang for your buck from the 8192, from that change from 1024 to 8192. So really excited now that these are the default startup parameters, because we do this anyways everywhere that we go. So really great. That's our number 9, these new default startup parameter values. Number 8, server-side join. So who hasn't seen the video of the rocket ship that Progress has been showing at every conference, and how much faster the shuttle takes off with server-side joins? All right, really great thing. It's a feature that's been there in SQL since forever, and they finally added it to the ABL, and it makes a huge difference if you're doing complex joins, complex where clauses for each table of table, each table of table of table. Now, it's a young enhancement, so it's not finished yet. There's still a lot more work to do there, but it's a great step in the right direction. Excited to have this enhancement in the database from a performance perspective. And again, today we're really seeing more and more where people are segregating their application server layer on different servers from their database layers. That's often an architectural requirement and a security requirement. So client server performance is becoming more and more important. Previously we had the app server agents were often connecting in shared memory to the database. And so again, these kinds of improvements are huge to the database. Server-side joins, number 8 on the database list. All right, number 7, SQLTruncateTooLarge and SQLWidthUpdate. Now you might argue that server-side joins is a much more important improvement, but not everybody is doing client-server connections to the database. Equally, not everyone is doing SQL connections, but a lot of people do SQL, and we've always seen these problems where the 4GL width of the field is wider than the SQL width, and so that SQL connection or that ODBC JDBC connection generates that error that the data that's being passed is larger than the SQL width. And traditionally how we fix that is we run dbtool. dbtool fixes the SQL width. We run that every night, every week. And occasionally we come across the error and we just deal with it. So now with SQLTruncateTooLarge and with SQLWidthUpdate, that all gets fixed automatically. Now there's one gotcha. When you use SQLTruncateTooLarge, in the original iteration of that parameter, you had on or off, and then later they added output. And what the difference was is the truncation of the field width, is that respected in the where clause, or is it only respected in the output? And that's a huge difference, right? If you say where field equals value, and you truncate the value because of the SQL width, your where clause is not going to find the record. So you want to use SQL width output probably most of the time. So the where clause uses the full field, but the output that's returned to the JDBC client, that uses the truncated field. And then go ahead and update the schema, update the SQL width for the larger value for the next usage. So SQLTruncateTooLarge, SQLWidthUpdate, number 7 on my list of top 10 DBA enhancements. All right, so let's go to number 6. Number 6, OpenEdge replication. There's 2 enhancements that came in version 12. Again, really excited. I haven't implemented these yet, but really excited about these and using these in production. And the first one is AI file streaming. And in a nutshell, what that does is, up until version 12.3, I believe, or 12.2, where they enabled this AI file streaming, what you had to do was, if the target was starting to fall behind from the source, either because of the speed of the machine or the disk I/O or the network, then all of those AI nodes would pool on the source side. They would pool in the pica buffers. And so that's where we needed these really large pica buffers to hold all of the pointers to the nodes. And then we ended up with all these locked AI extents on the production side, on the source side of the replication pair. Now with AI file streaming, those AI nodes get sent across the wire to the replication target, and the agent pools those nodes in a cache on the target side. So rather than pooling those nodes on the server side and locking the AI extents, we're pooling those on the target side. And so now the target, instead of it falling behind and instead of filling the pica buffers and all of the negative things that potentially go with filling the pica buffers, instead we're setting up this cache on the target side so that the data can stream over as quickly as possible, and then the target can apply, or I should say the agent can apply the changes to the targets as quickly as possible. And to go along with that, we have now a multi-threaded agent. So that's always also been a complaint of mine. On the source side, you've got 1,000 users making updates to the database. And on the target side, there's one lonely agent trying to write all of those changes to the database, right? And so during really busy times or on a very busy system that's doing a lot of writes, the target side ends up falling behind from the source, until finally the source kind of slows down and the target could catch up. So now with the multi-threaded agent, the idea here is that there's more user processes, more agent processes available, threads, to write the changes from the cache on the target side and write those changes to the databases. So that should increase our throughput and reduce the latency, really reduce the difference between the source side and the target side. So again, haven't tried this yet. It's really brand new in 12.2, 12.3, but I'm excited to implement this at our customers. These are great things that will turn on right away, and I think they're on by default actually in these versions of Progress. All right, number 5. Client-server improvements. So I mentioned earlier, especially with the architectural changes and requirements to segregate app server layers, PAS-OE layers from database, client-server improvements are really important. We're doing a lot more client-server communication. Server-side joins was a huge change, but I think these parameters, that they added them in late 10.2 and early version 11 of Progress. We've seen huge performance improvements, and that's, first of all those prefetch parameters. So when you send a message buffer across the wire from a 4GL server to a 4GL client, before these prefetch parameters, the maximum you would get is 16 records in a network message buffer. So even if you had an 8K message buffer, if you set this -mm to 8K, your maximum number of records that you would put in there would be 16, right? And now with prefetch numrex and prefetch factor, you can really say fill that message buffer as much as possible. I want 64 records, 128 records, fill it to 100% and send those records over to the client. Let's reduce the back and forth network traffic. And we've seen really, really huge performance improvements when you're doing large scans of large tables across client server networks, all right? Put this together with variable -mm support. So, when you wanted to change -mm in the past, you had to go to every possible client who was connecting, make sure you made all the changes everywhere. If you forgot one, well, that poor client wouldn't be able to connect to the server. Now with variable mm support, it's the server side that decides what the value of mm is going to be, and the clients will respect that value. So you start your database with -mm 8192 or 16384, and the clients will adjust to that, assuming they're 11 dot whatever clients that are connecting to the database. So this is a really great set of parameters, the prefetch parameters, fill those network message buffers, and the variable mm support. So, and then earlier we talked about the new default value of mm going from 1024 to 8192. I would tell you to beef that up to 16384 while you're at it. Fill those message buffers, send the messages across the wire, filled with records, as opposed to sending just one record or 16 records across the wire. So really good. Number 5, we've had really great success with these parameters in specific situations with client-server performance. So number 4, BI backup. I think a lot of you out there live with large BI files, right? So BI scan time that we talked about earlier, excited about that parameter. Most of you probably haven't upgraded to the version of Progress where that's supported, so you've probably all lived with large BI files. And the only way to fix that is to truncate the BI, which requires you to bring the database down. Well, an online backup prior to 11.4-ish would back up the entire BI file. So if you had a long transaction issue that grew the BI file from 1 gigabyte to 40 gigabytes, well, guess what? Until you truncate the BI, your online backups are going to be 40 gigabytes bigger, and there's nothing you can do about it other than stop the database and truncate the BI. And what Progress did was they said, you know what? As of this version, we're only going to back up active BI clusters. So only the clusters that have data in them, we're going to back up those clusters. So even if you have a 40 gig BI, if you only have 10 or 20 clusters of 16 megs each, we're only going to back up those BI. And so effectively that shrinks your backup down so that you don't have to back up all these empty unused clusters. Now do watch out if you're running 11.4, 11.5, somewhere around there, the early 11x releases, there was a bug where Pro Restore would not work properly under certain circumstances. So the backup is good, but the Pro Restore is unable to restore the backup that has these BI backup active process used. And the workaround, if you're running 11.4, I think it's up until 11.4, it's fixed in 11.5, is to do BI backup all. So either upgrade progress or make sure that you're backing up the entire BI file, which is the old functionality, until you put in the patch that fixes that bug. So watch out for that if you're running 11.1, 2, 3, 4 before this bug was fixed. All right? All right. Top 3, here we go. Top 3. Restart agent. You know, when we first got started with Fathom replication in version 9 and then OpenEdge replication in version 10, we were really excited. We started deploying this everywhere. And I remember distinctly, my mind was blown when I heard that you could not do a DSR util restart agent. You know, they put in DSR util restart server and they said, oh, if you need to restart the agent, you have to bounce the database. That's crazy. The target database, in many cases, is actually a production database. You're doing SQL extractions out of the target database. You can't just shut the database down in the middle of the day. It's being used by the business. You cannot do a shutdown of the database. And it took until 11.6 until they finally added this DSR util restart agent. And that has changed our life enormously, right? I mean, we still, I think, have 1 or 2 customers that are running older versions of Progress where there's no restart agent. And it happens all the time where we need to restart something. There's a lot of little bugs in OpenEdge replication in the earlier versions, 11.4, 5, 6, especially if you have 2 targets and you find the need where you need to restart the server and restart the agents, and you're like, oh, I can't restart the agents. I need to bounce the databases. In order to do it, I can't bounce the databases because someone is using one of those targets for SQL extractions or for reporting or something in production. Really caused a problem. So really excited about this restart agent. It's been there since 11.6, which is actually a number of years. So if you are on an older version of Progress, please at least get up to 11.7 before you migrate over to version 12. Number 2, we're almost to the end. Number 2, the new index rebuild parameters. These also changed my life. You know, people who do dump and loads. And I'll tell you, the one that probably changed my life the most is that -TF90 parameter. And that says when you're building your list of keys and memories, use up to 90% of system memory to build your keys. And we're essentially eliminating disk I/O, right? Modern systems have 64, 128 gigs of RAM. So you're essentially eliminating all disk I/O while you're doing your index rebuild. The only disk I/O you're doing is reading the keys out of the table. You're doing all of the sort and merge in memory, and then at the end you write the index to disk. So you minimize your disk I/O as much as possible, and you do as much as you can in memory. And prior to these parameters, we would actually create RAM disks, right? So we would create file systems in memory so that we could set the -T temp file parameter to use memory to fake progress into doing this sort and merge in memory through the use of these RAM disks. And now we don't have to do any of that anymore. It's built into here. And the other ones, merge threads and data scan threads, really huge parameters in terms of increasing the performance, the speed. And you know, we've seen in certain cases index rebuild times drop 75% just through the use of these parameters. So if you're doing index rebuilds today and you're not using these parameters, I urge you to use them. Last year I did some talks on index rebuild performance. So if you're interested, ping me offline or send me an email and I'll send you those presentations from last year. I did some benchmarks on these index rebuild parameters, and there's actually a few things in there that are surprising even to me in terms of what we found around some of these parameters. So by all means, use them. Ping me offline and I'll send you my presentation so you can see the benchmarks of how you can play with threads and merge threads and data scan threads, TB, TM, TF, and how those affect performance of the index rebuild. All right, number 1. In the chat, what do you think number 1 is? I'm going to pause here for a second for the people who are watching this live. If you're on If you're on a delay here, you'll see this afterwards. But number one in the chat, what's number one parameter? Number one, going once, going twice, LRU skips. LRU skips. This is the parameter where this is my parameter where I've walked into customers and they're experiencing huge performance problems, and I go in and I change this parameter online, live in production, and the problem disappears. It just goes away, and everyone is like, oh, woo! So thank you to Rich and to the engineering team. This parameter has made me look good so many times over the past few years just by enabling this parameter. Now in version 12, you saw earlier, it actually defaults to 100. So in version 12, you don't even have to worry about it. It's automatically enabled for you. But really, this is the best single performance enhancing startup parameter in years, maybe since something like -spin, which has been around for a while. So what a great parameter. I urge you, if you're running version 11 of Progress or version 10, no, it's not in version 10, version 11, turn on LRU skips. Or is it, sorry, I'm going to tell you, I don't remember if it's in 10.2b08. Everyone is kind of migrating to 11 now, so I mix up my versions. But turn on LRU skips, set it to 50 or 100, and just forget about it, and you're all set. And that's the number one recent or semi-recent startup parameter. And again, you can meet me afterwards in the chat if you disagree. That's my choice, all right? We're almost done. All right, it's bonus time. The all-time number one database enhancement ever. Type 2 storage areas, no question. I know it's a little bit older from version 10, but even this week we are converting a customer who's running 11.6 and still has a type 1 storage area, 100 gigabyte database, still on a type 1 storage area. Everything's still in the schema area, so they're still out there. So number one all-time change to the database improvement, these type 2 storage areas. Disagree with me? Want to fight about it? Want to talk about it? Join me in the chat afterwards in the Zoom meeting. Remember to disable theater mode so that you can see the link to the Zoom meeting. I'll see you guys there to talk about it, answer questions, and come and see me at our virtual booth. Happy to talk to you then too. Thank you very much.